Grüß, willkommen in einem meiner aufregendes Video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 27 of my game system design video series. In this video I'll attempt to analyse artillery and aircraft rules and determine some basic guidelines in their creation for use in micro armour figure gaming rules. This is my fourth update to the video, primarily focused on improved images and greater clarity in the concepts I am covering, as well as adding some comments in reference to musket and pike and ancients, if applicable. Let us first deal with artillery fire in this video. Artillery fire is normally indirect, that is, the shell travels along an arc to its target. The first question which needs to be asked concerning artillery fire is, will it get its own phase and will it get its own game mechanics, or will it be embedded in the standard fire game mechanics and phases? While it's possible to place all artillery fire in the standard fire phase, it's wise to remove some type of artillery fire from that phase and place it in its own special phase. This is in order to reduce the complexity of the standard fire phase. It must be also noted that if your game system is very simple, this will not be required. Let's first look at the type of artillery fire, starting with pre-planned fire. Pre-planned fire, such as area fire and interdiction fire, is not affected by any activity on the playing area and can be conducted in a special artillery phase if required. Counter battery fire, as it normally targets off-playing area enemy artillery, can also be placed into a special artillery phase. Even area fire, which is not pre-planned, can be placed here, as area fire normally consists of identifying a location, experiencing some form of delay, and then fire is conducted against the location. You're not firing against an enemy element, you're firing against a location on the playing area. Only direct fire support cannot be placed into a special phase, as it occurs in conjunction with movement and normal direct fire. Let's now drill into these type of artillery activities into greater detail. Area fire, or indirect fire against the location, is not affected by anything which occurs on the playing area. A player either pre-plans this type of fire, or during the game goes through a process of identifying a location, sending area fire information to the artillery, and then the artillery conducts fire against that location. As area fire targets a location and not an enemy element, it can be conducted in its own special phase. If designers add rules which cause the fall of fire to move or fall randomly, this additional complexity is certainly best kept in its own phase. It should be noted area fire can also include smoke barrages. Let's now look at interdiction fire. Interdiction fire has to be laid before any movement occurs. As interdiction fire is triggered by enemy movement, the actual interdiction fire combat would occur in the enemy's movement phase. But the setting down of an interdiction fire location, that is to determine if it's off target or not, has to be conducted before the movement phase. This is normally pre-planned, although it's possible for this to be initiated during the game using the same process as you would for area fire. As with area fire, the target is a location and not a specific enemy element. Let's now look at counter-battery fire. Counter-battery fire is triggered by enemy artillery or indirect fire. If the enemy conducts artillery or indirect fire, this could be located. Then, using a process of radar detection, sound ranging, or flash ranging, the exact location of the enemy artillery could be identified. Maybe not the exact, but approximate location. Once this occurs, the actual counter-battery fire occurs. Unless the game system is very simple, counter-battery fire is best conducted in its own phase, as the locating process represents non-standard activities. It would normally occur in the game turn after the enemy indirect fire, which triggers it, so some tracking is required. But most importantly, as the target is often off the playing area or deep behind the front line, it does not affect activity occurring on the front line of the playing area. While you are targeting an enemy element, or trying to, you are not really and you are not targeting a location on the playing area. It's not an exact targeting of the enemy element. So you could say it's a hybrid situation. Regardless, it's not on the playing area and doesn't affect any activity in the front line, thus can be placed in its own phase. Artillery fire which specifically targets enemy elements, normally observed by a forward observer who cools down fire and corrects it, does affect activity on the playing area and is called fire support. This type of artillery or indirect fire must be conducted in the standard fire phase. While it operates in a similar manner to indirect fire, it has a direct effect on other activity on the playing area. The first question which needs to be asked concerning artillery fire is, will it get its own phase and will it get its own game mechanics, or will it be embedded in the standard fire game mechanics and phases? While it's possible to place all artillery fire in the standard fire phase, it's wise to remove some type of artillery fire from that phase and place it in its own special phase. This is in order to reduce the complexity of the standard fire phase. It must be also noted that if your game system is very simple, this will not be required. Now let's look at aircraft support. In this case, the firing element is transitory. It only appears to fire from the sky and then leaves. Once again, we must ask ourselves if this should have its own game mechanics and phase, or if it should be embedded in the standard game mechanics and phases. Most aircraft activity, while able to support ground operation, is not directly linked with the ground operations. Air support is called in by an element on the playing area, but when the aircraft is launching its actual attack, it's the aircraft which is doing the observing and fire combat. There is no forward observer calling in corrections to any fire. As a result, all aircraft activity could be removed from the standard fire phase if required. Let's take a quick look at helicopters, which are a rather special case. It should be noted that helicopters can act as an aircraft, or work similar to an aircraft, can follow the same rules, or could act as a ground element, in which case it's treated as standard ground element. Examples of the former would be troop transport missions, and examples of the latter would be conducting direct fire against an enemy element. While I personally feel air-to-air combat should be abstracted away, rules such as Lightning War Red Storm do a nice job simplifying it to the point where it adds a lot of interest and variety and has no real downside. In that case, air-to-air simply represents opposing aircraft negating each other, with those aircraft simply being removed. This is an excellent example of rules which add some benefit, or bling, and at the same time having minimal negative impact. Comparing this with Corps Commander, where the air-to-air combat system is a complex and time-consuming affair, is striking. Aircraft which survive air-to-air combat and are on the playing area can then be subject to ground-to-air combat. This has no direct effect on the playing area, so can also be placed in a separate phase. The only record keeping is noting when a ground element has conducted ground-to-air combat, as this could affect observation, movement and fire combat in the standard fire phases, or movement phases. As the number of elements affected would be small, this is probably not a major issue. While it's possible air-to-ground combat could be used to directly affect activities in the playing area, it's not common. When aircraft arrives, or the exact timing of the arrival, or even the target can be so variable no commander would coordinate aircraft and ground movement that closely. As a result, air-to-ground combat could be kept separate. Once all aircraft activity are resolved, the aircraft are all removed, which ensures the playing area does not get cluttered with elements not directly related to activities in the standard fire phase. There is one complexity. Early in the war, the Germans and later the Western Allies often used light observation aircraft to locate enemy forces and bring down fire support or call in air support. These are the only aircraft which would normally be present on the playing area during a standard fire phase, but as they would rarely number more than one per side, this is not normally a major issue. By conducting activity which is not directly related to moving and conducting fire combat with ground-based elements on the playing area, you allow players to solely focus on those activities when these phases occur. When there is no artillery or aircraft activities, these non-core artillery and aircraft phases are simply skipped. This is one example where creating special phases does increase speed of play and play or game flow. The one caveat to this suggestion is the complexity of the game system. I commonly use a figure game set of rules based on an SPI board game, which uses a very simple game system. In this set of rules, artillery and aircraft activities are included in the standard combat phase, either phasing or non-phasing. If the game system is simple enough, it's better to bundle everything into as few phases as possible in order to simplify that aspect of the game system. Separating these functions only makes sense if there is a reasonable level of complexity involved. And so, in simple terms, or as a summary, if you're dealing with a very simple game system, such as KISS or a figure game conversion of a board game, artillery and aircraft can easily be built into the standard game mechanics and phases. A good example is the SPI Modern Battles rules, which only possesses a single combat phase for each player. Aircraft and artillery can simply be added to a combat. In this case, there is minimal special rules. But When dealing with anything more complex, dividing these activities out into their own phases is often the optimal solution. And so this concludes episode 27, my game system series of videos, in this case covering artillery and aircraft. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.